The alien jungle of Andara was a maze of towering trees and dense, thorny undergrowth. Daniel Reese stumbled through the thick vegetation, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The alien world was wild and unforgiving, every shadow seeming to hide dangers that Earth's explorers hadn't yet mapped. He was drenched in sweat, his body weary from days of wandering without contact from his team, lost in a world that seemed to swallow him whole. Daniel had come to Andara on a mission of peace, hoping to establish a rapport with the reclusive Amazons who ruled the forested lands. But what was supposed to be a diplomatic mission had quickly turned into a fight for survival. Rogue warriors had attacked without warning, their blue spears flashing in the sunlight, scattering his team into the depths of the jungle. Now, Daniel was alone, his only company the unfamiliar calls of Andaran wildlife and the rustle of alien leaves overhead. Suddenly, a sound reached him, a whisper of movement, like a shadow slipping through the trees. He turned, squinting through the dim light of the jungle, but saw nothing. His hand tightened around the handle of a makeshift spear, a remnant from their broken camp. He knew better than to assume he was safe. The Amazons were masters of their land, and if one of them had found him, it was likely too late. A figure emerged from the shadows, tall, lithe, and unmistakably alien. Her skin was a deep shade of violet, smooth and almost luminescent beneath the green glow of the Andaran canopy. Long, flowing hair the color of midnight cascaded over her shoulders, framing a face that was both sharp and graceful, with eyes like glowing amber that locked onto him with an unsettling intensity. Daniel barely had time to react before she sprang forward, her movements a blur. He barely managed to lift his spear, but she deflected it with a swift motion, knocking him off balance. The force of the strike sent him stumbling, and she took the opportunity to press him against a nearby tree, her arm like an iron bar across his throat. He struggled, feeling the rough bark dig into his back as he tried to catch his breath. "Human," she hissed, her voice low and melodic, yet carrying a dangerous edge. "Why do you trespass here? Speak quickly, before I decide you are of no use to me." Daniel's mind raced. He had heard tales of the Amazons, how they defended their borders fiercely, how they distrusted any outsiders. But he had also heard of their honor, of how they respected strength and cunning. He had to find a way to show her that he wasn't just a helpless wanderer. With a surge of desperate strength, he twisted out of her grip, using her momentary surprise to push her away. But Amazon warriors stumbled back a step, and for a heartbeat, they stood facing each other, both catching their breath. Daniel kept his makeshift spear raised, though he knew it was more for show than anything. Her eyes flared with surprise, and then something else, a hint of curiosity. "You fight well, for a human," she remarked, a hint of a smirk tugging at the corners of her lips. "But you are still far from home, lost in a world that will devour you." Daniel forced himself to stay steady, even as his pulse thundered in his ears. "I'm not here to fight your people," he said, his voice rough but firm. "I'm trying to survive, just like you. Help me, and I can make sure Earth's authorities see the Amazons as allies, not enemies. Or we can keep fighting until one of us makes a mistake." Her expression remained unreadable, but she seemed to consider his words. After a long silence, she slowly lowered her weapon, though she kept a wary stance. "Very well, human. I will guide you, if only to see if you are as clever as you think. But if you betray my trust, I will end you without hesitation." Daniel nodded, relief mingling with the tension that still coiled in his muscles. "Name's Daniel," he offered, trying to ease the tension between them. "And you are?" "Illyra," she replied, her voice softening just slightly as she spoke her name. "Remember it, human, for it may be the last kindness you hear." With that, she turned, moving through the undergrowth with a fluid grace, and Daniel followed her lead, wondering if he had just found a lifeline or a new danger that would end his mission before it had even truly begun. As the shadows of the alien forest closed around them, he couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter had set them both on a path neither could yet foresee. The days that followed were a test of endurance, patience, and trust. Daniel and Illyra moved deeper into the Andaran jungle, with Illyra guiding them through hidden trails known only to the Amazons. The terrain grew more treacherous, the undergrowth thickening into a maze of tangled roots and thorny vines. For Daniel, every step was a struggle against exhaustion and the relentless heat, but he forced himself to match Illyra's pace, unwilling to show weakness. Illyra moved with a quiet confidence, her violet skin blending seamlessly with the twilight hues of the jungle. She navigated the forest with an ease that Daniel envied, her senses attuned to the slightest changes in their surroundings. For whenever she paused, her head tilted as if listening to a distant whisper. Daniel knew better than to ask questions. He had already learned that Elira's silence was rarely empty. It spoke of her deep connection to the land, to the unseen life that thrived around them. Yet even amidst the harshness, there were moments of unexpected beauty. They passed through groves where alien flowers bloomed in spirals of electric blue, releasing a sweet scent that lingered in the humid air. Strange bioluminescent fungi glowed beneath the roots, casting eerie lights over their path, while creatures with iridescent wings darted between the leaves like living jewels. It was a world that could kill as easily as it could enchant. But the jungle was not their only challenge. The tension between Daniel and Elira was a constant undercurrent, a thread that wove through every interaction. They rarely spoke unless necessary, each word laden with the unspoken weight of their situation. Elira's golden eyes, sharp and calculating, seemed to study him at every turn, as if trying to decipher some hidden truth. Daniel could only guess at what she saw, a stranded human struggling to keep up, or something more. One evening, as they made camp by a small stream that trickled through the rocks, Daniel couldn't keep the questions to himself any longer. He watched as Elira crouched by the water's edge, her reflection wavering in the ripples. She was cleaning a wound on her arm, a gash from a stray thorn earlier that day. For the first time, she looked almost vulnerable, her expression softened in the fading light. He hesitated, then spoke, his voice cutting through the quiet murmur of the stream. "Why are you helping me, Elira? You don't trust me, I can see it in your eyes. And I know your people have no love for humans, especially after what happened with my crew." She paused, her hand stilling over the wound. For a long moment she didn't answer, her gaze fixed on the darkening water. Daniel wondered if he had overstepped, but then she turned to face him, her expression guarded. "You are right," she said, her voice carrying a quiet intensity. "I do not trust you, Daniel. I have seen what humans bring: violence, greed, a desire to conquer what they do not understand. My people remember the first contact with Earth's explorers, how they brought weapons before words. But you are different." She hesitated, as if weighing her next words. "I have not decided if that difference is a strength or a weakness." Daniel met her gaze, surprised by the hint of uncertainty in her tone. He shifted, feeling the rough bark of a tree against his back, and tried to put his thoughts into words. "I'm not here to conquer anything, Elira. Honestly, I don't even know what I'm doing here anymore. My team is gone. My mission's a mess. I just want to make it through this without becoming a statistic in some Earth report." She studied him, her expression inscrutable, then turned back to the stream, dipping her hands into the cool water. "Perhaps that is why I chose to guide you," she said finally, almost as if speaking to herself. "You remind me that not everything is as it seems, that even enemies can surprise us." They fell into a companionable silence after that, each lost in their thoughts as the jungle settled into its nightly symphony. For the first time, Daniel felt a glimmer of something beyond fear and survival and understanding, fragile but real. He glanced at Elira's profile, the faint glow of the bioluminescent fungi casting shadows across her features, and felt a pull he could not quite define. As the night deepened, the forest grew colder, and a chill settled into Daniel's bones. He wrapped his arms around himself, trying to ignore the discomfort, but Elira noticed. Without a word, she retrieved a woven cloak from her pack, crafted from some Andaran fabric that shimmered like 1,000 tiny stars, and draped it over his shoulders. Daniel blinked at the unexpected gesture, caught off guard by the simple kindness. "Thank you," he murmured, pulling the cloak tighter around him. He could feel the residual warmth of her body in the fabric, a reminder that for all their differences, she was as real and tangible as the world around them. Elira did not reply, but there was a faint curve to her lips as she settled back against a tree trunk, her gaze turned toward the canopy. Daniel followed her gaze, watching as the alien stars glimmered through the leaves, unfamiliar constellations dotting the sky. He wondered if Elira saw the same sky, if those stars held stories for her as they did for him. Sleep came slowly that night, and when it did, it was filled with fragmented dreams of Earth, of his lost crew, and of Elira's eyes, watching him with an expression he couldn't quite understand. The next morning, they resumed their journey, the air thick with the scent of morning rain. Elira's pace was brisk, but Daniel could sense a change in her demeanor. She spoke more freely, pointing out hidden paths and teaching him the ways of the Andaran forest, how to recognize the signs of dangerous creatures, where to find water hidden in the bark of trees, and how to listen for the faint hum of the forest's heart. She seemed to delight in testing him, offering cryptic clues and watching as he struggled to piece them together. When he managed to find a hidden spring beneath a cluster of luminous moss, she arched an eyebrow, a faint smile playing at her lips. "Perhaps you are not as hopeless as you appear," she remarked, her tone almost teasing. Daniel couldn't help but smile back, the tension between them easing into something warmer, something almost like friendship. He found himself looking forward to those moments, to the challenge in her eyes and the rare glimpses of her amusement. It was a strange feeling, one that made him forget, if only briefly, that they were still very much trapped in a dangerous land. But just as quickly as things seemed to settle, a new danger loomed on the horizon. One afternoon, as they climbed a ridge overlooking a valley thick with fog, Elira's posture suddenly stiffened. She raised a hand, signaling for silence, and Daniel followed her gaze to the distant edge of the valley, where dark figures moved through the mist warriors, their armor glinting with the deep blue insignia of the rogue faction. Daniel's breath caught. There were too many of them, more than he and Elira could hope to face alone. He turned to her, but she was already scanning their surroundings, her expression turning grim. "They must be searching for you," she said, her voice low, but there was a tremor of tension in it. "We cannot let them find us here. If they capture us, they will not show mercy." A chill settled in Daniel's chest, but he squared his shoulders, meeting her gaze. "Then we need to stay ahead of them. We'll find a way through this, Elira." For a moment she held his gaze, her expression conflicted, as if weighing whether to trust him with more than just her guidance. Then with a curt nod she turned, leading them down the ridge into the thick embrace of the jungle once more. As they moved, Daniel felt a sense of urgency settle over them, a reminder that the fragile understanding they had built could be shattered at any moment. But beneath the fear, something stronger took root, a determination to see this through, to fight for the fragile bond they had begun to forge in this alien land. And as the shadows of the jungle deepened around them, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that whatever came next would test them both, pushing them beyond the edge of what they thought possible, and into a future neither of them could yet imagine. The air hung thick with moisture as Daniel and Elira moved through the labyrinthine jungle of Andara. The rain from the previous night had soaked the earth, leaving a slippery path beneath their feet and a scent of wet leaves that clung to the air. Despite the dangers surrounding them, hostile terrain, and the rogue faction's relentless pursuit, Daniel couldn't ignore the subtle shifts in their dynamic. Each step through the underbrush seemed to deepen the unspoken understanding between them, as if the forest itself had become a witness to their fragile alliance. Elira led the way, her movements swift and sure, her violet skin glowing faintly beneath the filtered light. Her senses remained attuned to every rustle and murmur of the forest, and Daniel had learned to trust her instincts. When she slowed, he would slow, sensing her wariness like a ripple through the air. When she quickened her pace, he followed, trying to match her stride despite the weariness that tugged at his muscles. They reached a small clearing, and Elira suddenly raised a hand, her expression sharpening as she scanned the shadows. Daniel tensed, following her gaze, but saw only the thickening mist that clung to the ancient trees. He heard nothing, save for the distant calls of creatures hidden among the branches. But Elira's eyes had caught something, signs that Daniel's human senses couldn't detect. She knelt beside a cluster of twisted roots, her fingers tracing the outlines of footprints barely visible in the soft soil. The prints were large, clawed, and fresh, clear evidence of rogue scouts. Elira's jaw tightened as she studied the tracks, her lips pressed into a thin line. "They're close," she whispered, her voice barely more than a breath. "They've been searching this area. If they find our trail, they'll bring the others." Daniel swallowed hard, the realization sending a chill through him. They had been careful, moving quickly and doubling back to throw off their pursuers, but it seemed their precautions might not have been enough. He glanced back at the dense forest behind them, knowing that turning back would only lead them into a trap. "We have to keep moving," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "If we stay here too long." But before he could finish, Elira's hand shot out, gripping his arm with a force that startled him. Her eyes locked onto his, and for a moment he saw a flicker of something raw and unguarded in her gaze, something that cut through her usual stoic demeanor. "There is a place," she said slowly, as if each word cost her a great effort. "A place the rogues will not look. It is hidden, sacred to my people, a place I have not visited in many cycles. But it is not without pain." Daniel blinked, caught off guard by the emotion in her voice. He had seen Elira face danger with unflinching determination, but now there was a vulnerability in her that he had not expected. He hesitated, then nodded, sensing that pressing her for more would only push her back behind her walls. "If it's safe, we should go there," he replied gently. "I trust you, Elira." She studied him for a heartbeat longer, her grip on his arm tightening before she released him. Then, with a swift motion, she turned and led him deeper into the jungle. Daniel followed, the knot in his chest tightening as they moved through the thickening mist, wondering what memories this hidden place held for her and why she had chosen to share it with him. They traveled for hours, the landscape shifting subtly as they moved through groves of ancient trees and over ridges cloaked in mist. The air grew cooler, and the light faded into a muted twilight beneath the dense canopy. Tullyra's pace quickened, her movements growing more urgent, as if the weight of their destination pressed heavily on her shoulders. When they finally emerged from the tangled undergrowth, they stood at the edge of a hidden valley shrouded in mist. At the center of the valley, half buried in the earth and tangled with vines, lay the ruins of a shrine. Its smooth stone walls were etched with swirling patterns that glowed faintly, as if they held a memory of light from a time long past. Daniel felt a strange pull in his chest as he gazed at the shrine, a sense that he had stumbled upon something ancient and deeply significant. Illyra approached the stone steps leading into the ruins with a reverence he had not seen before. She knelt beside the carvings, tracing them with a tenderness that spoke of a history he could only guess at. "What is this place?" Daniel asked softly, stepping closer. He could see the tension in Illyra's posture, the way her shoulders stiffened as she touched the carvings. There was a shadow in her eyes that seemed to echo the somber quiet of the shrine. "It is a place of memories," Illyra replied, her voice hushed, as if afraid to disturb the air around them. "A shrine where my people once came to honor the spirits of the forest before the divisions and the wars. My mother brought me here as a child to teach me the old ways. Now it is forgotten, buried beneath the weight of time and conflict." Daniel listened, a knot forming in his throat. He thought of Earth, of the places he had left behind, cities once alive with culture, now reduced to crumbling ruins. He had thought himself numb to loss, but here in the shadow of this forgotten shrine, he understood Illyra's grief in a way that went beyond words. Illyra turned to face him, her amber eyes reflecting the pale light of the carvings. "I brought you here because it is the only place the rogues will not look, but also because I needed to remember what we once were before hatred consumed us." Her voice faltered, and Daniel saw the conflict in her eyes, the struggle between her duty as a warrior and the fragile hope that had led her to trust him. He wanted to reach out, to offer her some reassurance, but he sensed that words would only fall short. Instead, he knelt beside her, placing a hand on the cold stone. They sat together in silence, the mist swirling around them like the breath of ghosts. For the first time, Daniel felt a connection to Endara that went beyond the mission, something deeper tied to the land and the woman beside him. As dusk settled over the valley, they made camp at the foot of the shrine, lighting a small fire that crackled softly in the cool air. Illyra spoke more that night than she ever had before, sharing fragments of her past stories of the clan wars, of her mother's teachings, and of the day the rogue faction turned against the queen. Her voice held a quiet bitterness, but also a longing for a time when her people had been united. Daniel listened, sharing his own stories in return. He spoke of Earth's struggles, the barren cities that had driven him to seek a new purpose among the stars. He spoke of the loneliness that had haunted him since the loss of his crew, and the hope that Endara might offer a fresh start. He realized as he spoke that he had never shared so much of himself with anyone in years. By the time the fire burned low, the air between them had shifted, no longer charged with tension, but with a fragile understanding. Illyra's face softened in the glow of the embers, the hard lines of her warrior's mask blurring into something more human. Daniel found himself drawn to her in a way that frightened him, not because of her alien nature, but because she saw him as he was, stripped of pretense. But the danger still lingered beyond the valley, a reminder of the fragile nature of their safety. Illyra's gaze turned to the darkness beyond the firelight, her expression growing distant. "Tomorrow we leave this place," she said, her voice carrying a note of finality. "The shrine cannot shield us forever." Daniel nodded, but before she could rise, he reached out, his hand brushing hers. She stilled, her eyes meeting his, and for a moment the distance between them felt like it had vanished entirely. He held her gaze, speaking with a quiet determination. "We'll find a way through this, Illyra, together. I won't let you face it alone." For a moment she said nothing, but then her fingers curled around his, a silent acknowledgement of the promise he had made. As the fire's embers faded into the night, they sat side by side beneath the alien stars, aware that whatever the next day brought, they would face it as allies, maybe even as something more. The mist hung low over the valley as dawn broke, painting the ancient ruins in shades of silver and shadow. Daniel awoke to the faint light seeping through the canopy above, the cool air carrying a sense of foreboding that tightened in his chest. He glanced over at Illyra, who was already on her feet, her silhouette outlined against the pale light. Her expression was distant, her amber eyes fixed on the horizon, as if she could see the threats waiting beyond the valley's edge. Daniel pushed himself up, the aches in his body reminding him of their relentless journey. "Are you sure we're ready to leave?" he asked, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "We might not get another chance to rest." Illyra's gaze shifted to him, her expression unreadable. "We have no choice," she replied, her voice steady but laced with an edge of tension. "The rogues will not remain blind to our trail forever. If we linger, they will find us." And this place, she paused, her gaze drifting back to the shrine behind them, where the carved stone still glowed faintly. "This place is not meant for what lies ahead." Daniel nodded, recognizing the weight in her words. The shrine had offered a brief reprieve, a moment of shared reflection, but it could not protect them from the dangers that waited beyond. As they gathered their supplies and prepared to leave, Daniel felt the sting of uncertainty gnawing at the back of his mind. He knew their alliance was fragile, built on necessity and the faint hope of survival, but he also knew that hope alone would not be enough in the face of what was coming. They moved through the dense jungle in silence, following a narrow path that twisted through ancient trees and over rocky ridges. Illyra led the way, her steps sure and precise, but Daniel could sense the tension in her movements, the way her hand hovered near the hilt of her blade. She was listening, always listening for the signs of danger that lurked in the shadows. Daniel tried to match her focus, but his mind kept drifting back to their conversations by the shrine, to the vulnerability he had glimpsed beneath Illyra's warrior facade. He couldn't shake the feeling that their bond was changing, deepening into something he couldn't fully grasp. It was a strange, unsettling thought, one that made him wonder what might become of them if they ever reached safety. But his thoughts were abruptly cut short when Illyra stopped, raising a hand to signal silence. Daniel froze beside her, straining to hear whatever had caught her attention. At first there was nothing, only the soft rustle of leaves in the wind. But then, faint and distant, came the unmistakable sound of voices. Rogue voices. Illyra's jaw tightened, her eyes narrowing as she scanned the dense trees. "They are close," she whispered, her voice barely more than a breath. "We need to." Before she could finish, a sharp crack echoed through the forest, followed by a flash of movement. Daniel barely had time to register the danger before something slammed into his side, sending him sprawling to the ground. Pain flared through his ribs, and he rolled to his feet just in time to see a group of rogue warriors emerging from the shadows, their blue-painted armor glinting in the filtered light. Illyra moved with a blur of speed, her blade flashing as she met the first attacker. She ducked beneath a wild swing, driving her knife into the warrior's side before twisting away. But there were too many of them, more than Daniel could count, and they quickly surrounded her, their weapons gleaming with lethal intent. Daniel fought to regain his breath, scrambling to his feet and grabbing a fallen branch. He swung it wildly, catching one of the rogues across the jaw, but another quickly tackled him to the ground, knocking the air from his lungs. He struggled against the weight of the warrior pinning him, but the rogue's grip was like iron. He looked up just in time to see Illyra locked in a desperate struggle with the rogue leader, a massive figure whose armor bore the sigils of rebellion. Their blades clashed with a sound like thunder, each strike sending sparks into the air. Illyra's face was a mask of determination, but Daniel could see the strain in her movements, the way her muscles trembled with effort. Desperation surged through him. He couldn't let her face them alone, not after everything they had survived together. Summoning every ounce of strength he had left, Daniel twisted beneath his attacker, managing to free one arm. They seized a rock from the ground and smashed it into the rogue's helmet, sending the warrior reeling. Daniel pushed himself up, lunging toward Illyra with a wild yell. The rogue leader turned just as Daniel reached them, a sneer twisting his scarred face. He swung his blade at Daniel, but Illyra intercepted the strike, deflecting it with a snarl of effort. The rogue staggered back, momentarily unbalanced, and Daniel seized the opening. He drove the branch into the leader's chest, knocking the wind from his lungs and sending him crashing to the ground. The remaining rogues hesitated, their confidence wavering at the sight of their fallen leader. Illyra wasted no time. She surged forward, her movements a blur as she cut through their ranks with a ferocity that took Daniel's breath away. Within moments, the surviving rogues were retreating into the shadows, their shouts fading into the distance. Daniel sagged against a tree, gasping for air as the adrenaline slowly drained from his veins. He glanced over at Illyra, who stood over the body of the rogue leader, her chest heaving with exertion. Blood streaked her face, but her expression was cold, unreadable. "Are you hurt?" she asked, her voice rough as she sheathed her blade. Daniel could hear the tightness beneath her words, the concern that she tried to hide behind a warrior's composure. "Just bruised," he managed, wincing as he pressed a hand to his side. He pushed himself upright, offering her a faint, crooked smile. "You have a hell of a right hook, you know that." Illyra's lips twitched as if she was fighting a smile of her own, but the moment was short-lived. Her gaze drifted back to the fallen rogue leader, her expression hardening. "We need to move," she said, her voice turning urgent. "The others will not be far behind. We cannot stay here." Daniel nodded, but as he turned to follow her, a thought struck him, one that sent a chill crawling down his spine. He glanced back at the body of the rogue leader, a question burning on his tongue. "Illyra, why are they so determined to find us? This isn't just about me, is it?" She stiffened, and for a moment he thought she might ignore him. But then she turned, her eyes dark with a conflict he hadn't seen before. "They seek me, Daniel, not just you." Her voice dropped to a whisper, as if the admission pained her. I was once one of them." The words hit him like a blow, leaving him reeling. He stared at her, struggling to process what she had just revealed. What do you mean?" Illyra's jaw clenched, her expression shadowed by a bitterness that seemed to twist the light around them. "Before I swore loyalty to the Queen, the first fought alongside the rogues. I believed in their cause, believed that isolating ourselves from the outside world would protect our people. But I left when their hatred turned to bloodlust, when they began hunting those who disagreed." She turned away, her shoulders tense, and Daniel saw the weight of that past settle over her like a shroud. "They see my defection as a betrayal, and now they will not rest until I am brought to their justice." Daniel felt a surge of anger at the rogues who had turned against their own, but also at himself for not realizing the full scope of her burden sooner. He took a step closer, his voice low but firm. "You don't have to carry this alone, Illyra. We'll get through this, together." She met his gaze, and for a moment he saw the cracks in her armor, the pain, the fear, and the faint, fragile hope that had kept her moving forward. She didn't speak, but the way she looked at him was answer enough. And as they turned and began their descent into the jungle, Daniel felt a determination settle in his chest, a resolve to protect her, no matter the cost. But even as they fled into the shadows, he couldn't shake the feeling that their greatest challenge still lay ahead. For beyond the mist-shrouded trees, the rogue faction was gathering, and the whispers of war echoed through the forest, promising a final confrontation that would test every promise they had made to each other. The air was still in the early morning light, the mist curling through the dense trees like breath from the earth itself. Daniel and Illyra moved with urgency through the shadowed paths of the Andaran jungle, their footsteps barely making a sound on the damp ground. They had been running for hours, the cries of the rogue faction growing closer with every step, but now they knew there was no more time to run. They would have to make a stand. Illyra came to a stop beneath the wide canopy of an ancient tree, its twisted roots forming a natural barrier. She turned to face Daniel, her expression shadowed but determined, the violet hue of her skin glowing faintly in the dim light. Despite the exhaustion that lined her features, there was a fire in her eyes, a resolve that Daniel had come to recognize. "We can't outrun them any longer," she said, her voice low but steady. "The terrain here is dense. It gives us some advantage. If we use the trees for cover, we might hold them off long enough to escape toward the river." Daniel's chest tightened as he looked into the depths of the jungle where their pursuers would soon emerge. He felt the weight of their shared journey settle heavily in his bones, but he pushed the fear aside, focusing on the presence beside him. He nodded, gripping the makeshift spear he had fashioned from a sturdy branch. "We'll face them together." A ghost of a smile flickered across Illyra's lips, quickly swallowed by the gravity of the moment. "Stay close," she whispered, and for a heartbeat, their gazes held something unspoken passing between them, a fragile promise woven through their desperation. Then the silence shattered as the rogue warriors appeared from the trees, their blue-painted armor blending with the shadows, blades glinting in the pale dawn light. At their head was a tall, scarred leader, his eyes gleaming with a fierce intensity. He raised a hand, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. "So the traitor stands with her human," he called, his sneer twisting his features. "Illyra, you shame your people. You think you can hide behind him, but you will answer for your betrayal." Illyra's jaw tightened, But she did not flinch. "I left because I saw what you had become, obsessed with fear, willing to destroy anyone who disagreed with you," she shot back. "I chose a different path. And if you think I'll bend to your will again, you're mistaken." The leader's face darkened, and with a guttural command, he sent his warriors surging forward. The clearing erupted into chaos. Daniel found himself locked in combat with a rogue warrior parrying blows with his spear as he was driven back against the tree roots. His muscles burned with every movement, but he fought on, gritting his teeth as he blocked strike after strike. The rogue was relentless, but Daniel's desperation kept him on his feet. Nearby, Elira moved with the grace of a dancer, her blade flashing as she faced two attackers at once. Her movements were precise, every strike deliberate, but Daniel could see the strain in her eyes, the weight of each blow. She spun away from one attacker, driving her blade into the side of another, but more warriors closed in around her, pushing her toward the edge of the clearing. Daniel's breath came in ragged gasps as he fought off his own attacker, but he could feel their situation growing more desperate by the second. His thoughts raced. If they couldn't break through the rogue's line, they would be overwhelmed. He caught a glimpse of Elira's face, set, determined, but edged with a fear he had never seen before. A surge of anger and resolve flooded through him. He couldn't let her face this alone, not after everything they had fought for. With a desperate yell, he lunged at the rogue warrior in front of him, knocking them to the ground with a tackle that sent pain flaring through his side. He twisted, grabbing a rock from the mud and slamming it into the warrior's helmet. The rogue fell back, stunned, and Daniel staggered to his feet, ignoring the throbbing in his ribs. He turned just in time to see Elira locked in a brutal struggle with the rogue leader. Their blades clashed, sparks flying with each strike, their faces inches apart. The leader sneered, forcing Elira back step by step, his strength threatening to overpower her. Daniel's heart clenched as he watched, but Elira's expression suddenly changed. Her lips curled into a defiant smile, and with a quick twist, she freed her blade from the clash, slicing through the leader's guard. Her knife found its mark, plunging into the leader's side. He gasped, stumbling back, his hand clutching the wound as blood stained the ground beneath him. The remaining rogues froze, their leader's fall sending a shockwave through their ranks. Daniel seized the moment, shouting, "You're beaten. Go, before you join him." The warriors hesitated, fear and uncertainty flashing in their eyes. Then, one by one, they retreated into the shadows, their footsteps fading into the depths of the jungle. The clearing fell into silence, broken only by the ragged breaths of the survivors. Daniel turned to Elira, who stood over the fallen leader, her shoulders slumped with exhaustion. She looked down at the body, her face a mask of grief and determination. "It didn't have to be this way," she murmured, her voice barely audible. Daniel approached her, placing a hand gently on her arm. "You made the right choice, Elira. You chose hope, something worth fighting for." She looked up at him, her eyes glistening with unspoken emotions. For a moment she said nothing, but then she nodded, letting out a breath that seemed to carry years of weight. Perhaps you're right," she whispered, "but the road doesn't end here." They made their way to the river's edge, where the water ran clear and cold, carrying away the last remnants of battle. Elira knelt, washing the blood from her hands, her expression distant as she watched the ripples spreading across the riprap. Daniel joined her, the cool water soothing the bruises on his skin. But as the adrenaline ebbed away, he felt the uncertainty of the future settling in. "What happens now?" he asked softly, his voice carrying the weight of everything left unsaid. "And when we reach the Queen, what will you tell her? What will she do with us?" Elira was silent for a long moment, her fingers trailing through the water. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet but firm. "I will tell her that there is another way, that the hatred between our people does not need to define us, and that I found hope in the most unexpected place." She turned to him, her eyes searching his face with a softness he had never seen before. "I will tell her the truth, Daniel, that you are more than a stranger from the stars, that you are my ally, and perhaps something more." Daniel's heart swelled at her words, a warmth spreading through him that he had thought long buried. He took her hand, feeling the roughness of her fingers against his own, and he realized that in this alien world, he had found something he hadn't known he was searching for. "Then we'll face whatever comes together," he said, his voice steady, "no matter what the future holds." Elira met his gaze, and for the first time, a true smile broke across her face, a smile that lit up the shadows beneath the trees, that spoke of hope and new beginnings. And as they rose to their feet, the sun broke through the canopy above, casting beams of golden light across the river, turning the water into a stream of molten gold. They stood together at the river's edge, side by side, as the echoes of the past began to fade into the distance. The jungle, once a place of danger and shadows, now seemed like a land of possibilities, a place where two souls from worlds apart had forged a new path forward. Elira squeezed Daniel's hand, a quiet promise in her touch. "We will find our place in this world," she said softly. "And together we will make sure that it is better than what came before." With that, they turned toward the horizon, the path ahead still uncertain but no longer daunting. They walked together, their steps in rhythm, knowing that whatever challenges lay beyond the forest, they would face them side by side, bound by a trust that had been tested in fire and forged anew.